even need to push for maxEB in the electric fork? Do we want to discuss I guess the reason why we would push for this, or are people on the same page about that? Anybody object or not see the importance of trying to push for maxEB in this fork?
I can go first from the Prism team as being the one who's been disagreeing so far. So my opinion here is that some people on the team think this is super complex, and after looking at it, it's not that bad. I think what we're in a position now is that there are three things that we want, and we all want them now, and that's maxEB, inclusion list, and PeerDAS. And in my opinion, it starts with maxEB being the sort of highest impact, then PeerDAS, then inclusion list.
What do you mean by impact? Like
that, like there's the highest demand for this feature. Like
okay.
People really want it, and that it solves a problem that we think is more urgent, in my opinion, than other things. Like PeerDAS is the next most urgent thing, with like maybe L2s taking off. But consolidation with maxEB seems to be the highest. So from the like Prism point of view, we're willing to spend a lot of time on this and get it going and to make it happen in Electra if that's the decision. So we're going to commit to that if we're wanting to do one or more of those three things. So yeah, totally. I think we're maybe on the same page about the need and importance for it, except Mike is saying his order is reversed. So I'm saying that there's censorship on chain now, but there's a cost to it, and that you eventually run out of money, and then eventually you do get included. So I'm seeing inclusion list as the lowest out of the three, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, where it becomes a little more subjective, right? Like it's kind of a value judgment. I guess my take on this, and I'm in kind of a weird place because obviously I love maxEB and like it's something I've been pushing on for like a really long time. My read on the situation kind of right around the turn, like the beginning of the new year, is that it only seemed like one of the three was going to get in Electra, right? Like one of the three Preston mentioned. And it seemed like inclusion list felt the most important and was the lowest complexity. So that's why I've been pushing that like full steam ahead. If we can get both maxEB, my order, actually, I think I would put PeerDAS last. I think inclusion list, maxEB, and then PeerDAS.
And my understanding is PeerDAS can be worked on in parallel anyway. And so we can kind of just say like it's ready when it's ready. And then like if we have to coordinate like a quick hard fork after Electra that's consensus layer only, that's even if it takes place 2 months after Electra or whatever, that we can do that.
Yeah.
So like that I don't know, that's just my reason for why PeerDAS is lower priority, because it can be done in parallel. But
your mic's a bit low, Gajinder.
Mine? Like
no, Gajinder's.
All right, is it okay now? So yeah, so in my opinion, I don't think there is any 2-month hard fork because, but because the entire testing and the DevNet process itself is gonna take more than that, and everybody, just gets exhausted by the last hard fork and is trying to optimize it or fix issues around it. But yeah, I sort of agree that I think maxEB, I would say, has less complexity than inclusion list, because inclusion list has more moving parts and maxEB is only mostly about state transition and sort of state management, which does not has as many moving parts as inclusion list. And but if I think about Lodestar, I think we can basically both work on maxEB as well as inclusion list and push for it. And regarding PeerDAS, yeah, I agree that it can be totally done as an independent thing. And right now, looking at the L2 prices, they are super cheap as of now, and maybe in time they will increase and we'll need PeerDAS. But it seems to me as of now, market doesn't need PRS. But yeah, it will need PRS in coming future, and that's what we should prepare for. But so I am all for maxEB and inclusionist in the next fork.
Lighthouse certainly has the resources to do both, but I don't know about other teams.
We could probably do two of them. There's this model we have started thinking was like, do we want to do something in 2024? And that's kind of a stupid approach. So if we say we want both of these things, then we'll do both of them. It's just going to take as long as it takes. So we won't commit to a timeline, which we shouldn't really anyway. So if we want to do both, we'll do both, and then be understanding if any particular team is like a couple weeks behind another one.
What?
Yeah, I agree. 2024 is a bit of, a random deadline that we have placed on ourselves. And yeah, if we sort of push to one quarter into 2025, it wouldn't really break anything.
Did that 2024 timeline come from the execution layer?
So I think it was related to like justification for not including vertical in this fork. So like what might end up happening is like maybe the work that we have to do in the consensus layer is greater than the work that the execution layer is like planning.
Then they can get a head start on vertical, can't they? Even
that's sort of what I was thinking, is like if the holdup is consensus layer dev work, then and everyone knows what is going to happen in the next fork, which is like more work for the EL, then like that also doesn't seem like the worst place to be in.
yeah.
Sorry, what did you say about EL? Because I'm also working in Verkle, so I know a little bit of status, what's going on
Well,
over
like,
there.
it was basically, the idea is like we're not doing vertical in this fork, and the idea was that then ideally we have a quick fork where we get some stuff in and we do vertical next fork, and in that case we don't want to pack. The logic was we don't want to pack too much in this quick fork to delay vertical even longer. And so if the consensus layer is lagging the execution layer and how long it takes to implement Electra, potentially that holds the execution layer back from working on vertical, I think, is what you were kind of implying.
I was thinking that might have been part of the thought process, but like realistically, I feel like what might be more likely is if there's more, if the current fork is being delayed because of consensus work, then like the EL teams should be able to just like move forward with vertical, right? Because that's like more EL heavy work anyways.
I was just going to add, I think that's correct. As someone who's spending time on vertical, I think that was at least partial of the justification or reason thought process. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's something along TikToking between all forks.
Yeah.
I think the fear is that if, for example, we push this next Electra into, for example, first quarter of 2025, then EL devs will try pushing in something which is not workable, and that will sort of delay or distract them from basically jumping onto the workable bandwagon. And I think that is the fear, and that basically psychologically will happen, because if EL camp will see that those who are not basically working on workable, that there is something that can extra be pushed into it, they will go for it. And of course there are so many things that are out there. So maybe that is the real reasoning, because otherwise, I mean, definitely EL guys can just work on whatever is on workable or on the Electra and wrap it up and then focus onto the next fork. But I don't think it works that way when you know that a fork is going to happen and there is still something that can go in.
Okay, that makes sense. So, I mean, my question then is like, I'm not a cross inclusion list, so I don't know I mean, I wish Poland was here because he's doing that more, but like most of I don't know, I like, it's hard to say that including both maxEB and inclusion lists would realistically push us that much further back, just because neither are like big features. They're not they're not blobs, right? They're not like like the auxiliary PRs say that we included into 4844, you know, I don't think those, or the EIPs besides 4844 that made it into Deneb were really quite easy to implement. At least that was my understanding. And most of the time that went into Deneb was like making sure blobs worked and dealing with passing them around and all that stuff. So like, I mean, yeah, I guess it's what I'm trying to say is that it's debatable that trying to put both of them into Electra is really going to slow us down that much.
So I think again, the scope of inclusion list is similar to blobs in that sense that, you know, and there is basically this new concept. So there is availability of blobs concept, and then there is availability of IL concept, which is a little bit different from availability of blobs, because you don't need IL all the time. You only need it at some particular head, or, you know, while train syncing, you don't need it. So it's a bit different, and it will take time for people to get used to it and developers to wrap their head around it, apart from the fact that so many people are not getting, and basically, for example, I'm having these discussions, and earlier I was also not on the bandwagon that, you know, IL should be forward. So, I mean, there are so many new concepts that are around IL. I mean, not really in terms of research, but in terms of the developers who are going to work on it. And that way, IL has more moving parts in my scenario, and maxEB, on the sense, does not has that moving parts. It's about, you know, making sure we have state transition taken care of, we process deposits correctly, we basically reward correctly, etc. You know, that way it's not really a major chunk, and I would basically think that I would think that, you know, it is easy to get an implementation out there. So, but what I think in terms of features, if you see, you know, what are the features we are rolling out on the blockchain, and the risk of these features, right? So I wouldn't like to club them. This is if, for example, I would be a PM for a blockchain, I wouldn't like to club them. I would basically like to make sure that one feature goes separate from the other feature. That is the only thing, but apart from that, I think, yeah, they can go in together.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense, that on the engineering side, since we have another thing attached to a block, but that is not embedded in the beacon block, that does add a little bit, although not as much as a blob, I would say, because yeah, I just don't think it, like, there's no fancy KZG cryptography, and there's basically just like a single of these objects, and you don't have to verify anything more than a single signature. And yeah, I think mostly that. And then I don't think there's nothing in that. There's the IL, it wouldn't be embedded in the block, whereas like the blobs themselves have to have some correspondence with the block, and there's a Merkle proof to verify, whereas like the IL, I'm pretty sure it's just a signature from the current slot proposer to verify, which makes it not that bad. And but it is more than maxEB in terms of just engineering work. Now, Mike said something along maxEB being bigger on research and spec changes, where inclusion list is bigger on engineering. Mike, are you saying that because I do think it's true that the inclusion list spec is more developed than the maxEB spec? There's still some work to do on like making the maxEB spec more clean, and also there's things that are missing that were in the agenda. that need to be decided on. But yeah, what's your reasoning for saying that?
Yeah, I guess just like part of the reason I stopped pushing maxEB when the sentiment felt like it wasn't going very well was because if you look at the maxEB spec, it's like 1,000 lines delta in the consensus. You know, like you have to get the consolidation right, you have to change the churn, you have to get the like. There's just a lot more intricate pieces. But I guess like if it's all deterministic stuff, like you said, it's none of the engineering stuff. It's all just like specification. Then like maybe it's a lot easier to translate. Like once we get the spec ironed out into the code. But yeah, that's kind of my intuition. I agree that like the IL spec feels, at least it feels like there's less like questions around it. I don't know. From your looking at the maxEB spec, did you find it feasible that you could like split it into two? Like, is there any portion of maxEB that you would like to divide and do first? Or, I mean, my take back in like in January was like it feels like only useful if we do it all.
Same. I also wouldn't like to split it too much because, for one, like consolidation, like I know Preston had floated the idea of maybe splitting consolidations out from this and just doing a maxEB increase. I'm less, I guess less enthusiastic on that because for one, consolidations take time. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me explain that. It's just from the implementation standpoint. It's easier to reason about, okay, if I have two features here, if I can first increase the maxEB, great, and then I can implement consolidations. So in terms of like spec, like it could be one.
So not in terms of the fork being split, but just literally splitting up the spec and into basically two EIPs or something.
You can dismiss my feedback as saying this is an implementation detail, which I would agree. So as we're like thinking about implementing it, it would have been nice to see it in two pieces that ship together, but it's not that big of a deal. It just is a little bit of a cognitive reasoning. It takes a little bit longer, but it's otherwise fine.
Then I thought you meant that we would like split it out of the fork and only do yeah. So then there are things that I think make maxEB simpler that are yet to be decided. I mean, because they've been left out of the spec. So one of them is like, and I had this in the agenda. So like, how do we handle changing to like the compounding withdrawal prefix? And there's basically two options there. I think there's two functions that we could put it in. One is the thing that an inside process pending deposits, which is once a new deposit has been added and it's going to go to a validator, it's made it through the whole queue, and then it just gets to be actually applied to the validator's balance. At that point, we could change the withdrawal credentials. So you can change yours to 0x02 by making another deposit. That's one way. And then another way is inside process consolidation. So if you've published a consolidation, it's gone through the queue, and at the point where like your validator gets consolidated, then it would change to 0x02. Both of those are simple because it's each of those is basically a one-line change to those functions in the spec. What would be more complex and might not actually make sense actually, but like a beacon chain operation to change, similar to BLS to execution change. That's obviously more complex, and actually I'm not sure that makes sense because you can't really change these things. And well, no, it would make sense. You could do it because then you could change your withdrawal. You could change to be a compounding validator without having to make a deposit. And with this deposit method, you need at least one ETH because the deposit contract won't accept less than one ETH. So like by having a beacon chain operation, you wouldn't need one ETH, but that adds in all the complexity of having a new gossip topic to gossip these things and spam prevention and all that. So that's one place where the spec can be made simple. Like if we just say there's only two ways to become a compounding validator, you do a consolidation or you make a deposit. That's a simplification. Another simplification is the question of like the spec does not specify how we actually get these signed consolidation operations into blocks. And one way again is another beacon chain operation. That's more complex because you have to broadcast your signed consolidation messages. Again, like having a new gossip topic, dealing with spam, all more complex. Another way, much less complex, is we just say you're gonna have to wait for a block proposal. And like once you get a block proposal, like you'll submit it to your local beacon node. And once you get a block proposal, it'll pack it in the block. That's less complex. So we could opt for less complexity in both of those options. And like we know that like the big fish here is getting the staking pools to consolidate, and they're going to have plenty of block proposals, so that won't slow them down. And in fact, maybe they could even implement an off-chain solution where people could send in their consolidations and they'll pack them in their blocks, you know? So yeah, all of those are avenues where we can make maxEB less complex. Right now they're not specified though, so it won't look like less complexity necessarily because the spec is just underspecified at the point.
I think we have been seeing maxEB only with the value of consolidation. And one thing, for example, when we did a light client breakout call, we basically figured out that if we introduce a light client slashing and we have maxEB, then basically light client can actually give more security with the same number of validators in the committee, because and if we, for example, put bigger more constraints that to get selected into light client committee you need to have this cutoff effective balance, so that probably can basically provide more security for light client apps. And that is something that is a value which is very different from just consolidation and is actually providing a value to the ecosystem as well. I mean consolidation does also provide value to everything else, so it would be like single slot finality kind of a thing, but again within the ambit of light clients, right? So we can gradually try to increase the security that is out there around light client by raising the amount of cutoff effective balance that one might require to participate in light client committee.
Yeah. Zoom is telling me that if I don't upgrade now, they're gonna cut the meeting off in 10 minutes. So I guess I'm gonna upgrade so I don't run into this fucking problem on Friday as well. How ridiculous.
Can you just send us a new
You
Zoom
can
link?
you can just start a new meeting. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and just send it in
No,
the
it's just that, like, I also don't want the Friday meeting to get interrupted in the middle of it and then have to like have people start a new meeting. But yeah, for this one, I guess I'll send it. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll do it on this. Depends on what's faster. But yeah, I think this will end up being the same amount of time. I don't want this to happen on Friday, so
it's a good time box feature.
yeah. I think it's ridiculous because I would just basically never choose Zoom again. Basically, what I'm going to do after these two. Anyway. But yeah, so okay, so what about another thing to discuss is like, I mean, it's dangerous, but we don't actually know where the first bottlenecks are going to come up in the consensus clients. if the data set grows too large.
Yeah, that will be very beneficial for Lodestar if we are able to reduce the validator size. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just beneficial for every. It's beneficial for like future roadmap goals.
So if I understand this correctly, it sounds like we do have consensus in pushing this for Electra. It's just a matter of how and whether or not we can further specify maxEB into something more simple.
Right.
So the way I think I would want to see if this sort of thing can happen is that maybe have maxEB out and basically maxEB fork out by September, and then by next so by next March we basically roll out inclusion list, and then basically work maybe towards the end of 2025, which is the timeline. I think that's what Verkle is looking at as of now.
Wait, end of 2025? So you're saying the fork after?
So yeah, no. So I want, for example, Electra in September, and then maybe by March we can do a fork with inclusion list, and basically in the second half of the next year we can do Verkle. Because I mean Verkle is super light for CL. There is nothing to do, just to add a field in the execution header. So for us Verkle is nothing.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's see what other things are on the agenda now.
Wait, I'm still confused by this. You're saying do Electra in like just as is without maxEB inclusionless or pure DAS, and then do F star in like February. So do 2 forks by like next February. Is that right?
Yeah, but in September let's push in maxEB. With maxEB in September, because I'm assuming most of the research most of the effort is, again, as you mentioned, in research and figuring out the thing, but implementing it I don't see, because everything is deterministic, and when we have spec test and they will basically figure this, they will basically make sure that all the clients have implemented it correctly. So I again, I don't see many moving parts over here, in the sense that okay, let's just put our brains down and just get it done with, and then we can move to inclusion list, which has a bit more moving parts, and I think people will also take some time to get used to it by then.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm sorry. I was dealing with a little bit of payment, but we're talking about 2 forks now. We're talking about splitting the fork up into 2 Electra.
Yeah, that's my proposal, that we with maxEB we just pack the current fork and push it out by September.
Okay. And which one would you say? Are you saying would go in the September fork?
maxEB goes in September and inclusion list in March. March.
Okay, and your point is that well, wait a minute though, because our push for the earlier timeline in 2024 was that we wanted to go faster so people don't shove things into this fork on the execution side. But if we do maxEB in September, okay, inclusion lists, is that mostly a consensus layer fork? Is that why? Because that doesn't seem to solve the problem of people trying to add stuff into the fork if we go beyond 2024. Because won't they just add stuff into the March fork?
So inclusion list has some execution side things. For example, they have to support new API and they have to support new validation for a block, whether it satisfies the previous inclusion list or not, and basically caching the previous. But again, it is an engineering problem for EL side, which sort of seems easy to me compared to Verkle, which is a very big thing. And I think, for example, they could basically just deal with it by the next Feb, and whatever else they want to push in, they can just push in by September to the next fork, which we can bundle with maxEB. But because, I'm fine if we basically chunk together maxEB and IL together and push it by next Feb, but I don't want to see the rollout of these two things together, because the risk in my eyes is a bit bigger that these are two meaningful or two changes which impact in a big way to how clients operate and how people perceive Ethereum blockchain, and I wouldn't want them to go in the same fork as such. But yes, complexity wise, if we extend our next fork Electra into February, they could be packed. That's why I'm suggesting to folks that, let's get maxEB out a little earlier along with the other EIPs, and then we have 4 or 5 months to deal with IL, which should be sufficient in my opinion for all the clients to come on board.
So, okay, so it'd be like maxEB and then like 7002, because those have to, like, there are changes from, like 7002 would have to go in the September fork, the partial withdrawals and the execution list initiated exits.
Yeah. So
it's everything. So you're proposing that the September fork is everything but inclusion list, but that there's like an inclusion list fork more or less.
Yeah. So we basically follow up maxEB fork very quickly after by an inclusion list fork, and yeah. So it could even happen even before February if the teams get ready by then.
Let's see, what is it? March, April, May, June, July, August, September. Yeah, September might be fast, but if the goal is September, it's going to be shipped in November, right? So, because I don't know, I can only speak for the Lighthouse side. If the spec were written today, we could have like testnet ready code definitely inside a month. So like, I don't know. Like, if we have test nets running, then, how long after initial test nets run do we actually end up with releases?
I think the lag's like a couple months, so 2 or 3 months probably.
So
to get a whole testnet cycle, 3 months maybe.
So testnets here might not even need much longer, because everything could be so deterministic in terms of the state transition change.
Let's assume that, well, okay, never mind, because the ELs will take longer than how long would the ELs take to do this? Because they have to do SSZ and stuff, right? How long do you think it would take ELs to be testnet ready? Because you're gonna have to do 7002, and then once you've done 7002, throw a maxEB on top of it is trivial, but like that's I think the main. Like, because you need SSZ, that would be the main. Yeah, I mean, definitely we'll have the timing discussion on ACD, but like, let's also front run this timing discussion so we have some idea of if what we're thinking about is crazy or not.
Do you think it would be easier to just have a goal for like a POC at least with what EIPs we can do for like this first batch? Because it sounds like we're planning for really like 2 forks here, and we should just figure out what's going into number 1 and what's going to number 2, and then just work towards like that POC number 1.
Well, that's what we're discussing now, Mike. Mike is asking, are we? But we're just discussing it. And I think in order to even discuss if this is a viable path, we do have to, like, the first question that comes up, what is a natural timeline? And like I'm saying, if it takes us, I mean, I think it's honestly kind of, let's see, it's March 20th, so like April, so like I think it's actually kind of pessimistic to say it would be a month to hammer out all the spec pieces. That's a bit pessimistic in my mind. And then another month to hammer out all the implementations, at least from the Lighthouse side. Then we could be launching test nets around mid-May. And this is just for maxEB, Mike. maxEB plus 7002, because those are there. Well, and what else is going into this fork? Oh, we have
6110.
We have the attestation thing to get in. I don't know how quick that is, but I thought that was a quick change.
Yeah. So basically moving, so getting the data, SAM's the committee index, right? That is the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that should be pretty easy one.
That should be pretty easy, but then 6110, that's the one that is more tricky. Like 6110 is really conducive to maxEB. So like, but 6110 is more of a execution layer thing. So do we have any idea on how long that 6110 would take on the execution side?
I don't think it would take much. Some other teammate on Ethereum JS is working on it, but it seems like it shouldn't take much because it's just getting the deposits, putting them in a queue, and chunking them out, right? So
Yeah, I think it's really easy. I think 1 or 2 weeks, depending on if we have tests to verify things, then it's probably something we can do in under a week.
Okay, and how much, is there a lot of spec work left to do in 6110, or is that pretty much spec'd?
I think it's pretty much spec. I haven't taken a chance to implement it yet, but I've been keeping an eye on the spec, and it has some similarities with 7002 in that we're like sort of doing some processing post block, but I think the spec is mostly there. We went over it with Mikhail at Dev Connect and seemed fine.
Okay, so then
that's probably one of the easiest EIPs for us for the next fork.
Cool. Okay, so then all right, I don't know, I guess the biggest unknown in this question of like how quickly could we be to test nets if we had a fork with just 7549, 6110, and maxEB. Forgot the number for that, but it's like the question is how quickly could we get to 7002? how quickly could we be to test nets? And the biggest unknown in that question is how long would it take to get the spec like to a reasonable point, and then implementation. But I think the implementation is a bit more clear, at least from Lighthouse's side. Like I said, I think we could, if the spec was clear, I think we could get it testnet ready in like a month. That wouldn't be outrageous. So go ahead, Sean.
I was just gonna say I like the idea of the aggressive timeline if we want to do a small fork and like just committing to features. That sounds great. But I do think we should get back to like the technical parts of maxEB and like have this discussion like broader, I guess. Like it is good we're talking about it now, but like we need more input from more people.
Right. That's a good point. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just that these all do kind of blend together. But in terms of technical discussion for maxEB, honestly, the only discussion I can see, like the only decisions that need to be made are where we put the change, like I said, the things we already discussed, like where we put the change to compounding withdrawal prefix, like whether or not we have a gossip topic for that. Like it's all about user experience. So like the easiest user experience is that you broadcast it like a BLS change. And similarly, that if you want to consolidate, you broadcast it like a BLS change. Those are both the easiest things. But to make it a smaller fork that makes it less easy, we can forego that, and then you'd have to deposit an ETH into the deposit contract if you want to be compounding, and you would have to, I don't know, either wait for a block or send your consolidation to a staking pool. Go ahead, Sean.
So I feel like since we all have the BLS to execution change message infrastructure, I feel like if we follow that pattern for other messages, it isn't really going to be that much extra engineering. Like it might be duplicating code, but as long as it's like fundamentally the same type of message, like it's not that much additional. Yes, Mike?
Oh, my point's a follow-up. So if there's any response to your thing, they should.
If there's any what?
Okay. My other point was just like in the future, if another EIP to allow you to change your withdrawal credential would make a lot of sense. Like the fact that right now I can upgrade from like 0x1 or 0x0 to 0x01, but I can't change the like address that it points to, I think is kind of weird. So if in the future we made it so that you could change the address it points to, we could also bundle that with a function to change the prefix, which could be like a follow-up for, not necessarily like in the initial maxEB thing. So
You mean being able to change the execution address once it's been updated?
yeah,
I feel like that is never going to happen. That would break so much on a security level. Like
no, I mean you still have to sign it from the original address. Like if my
okay,
the signature comes from the
I
execution
understand.
layer.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Like that just seems like a no-brainer feature.
Yeah,
That
that's not a
should
bad
happen at
idea.
some point.
That seems like a good.
So
and
we could just
and
bundle that with a prefix change. Yeah.
to compounding, yeah. Or well, and at that point, then it's not even a beacon chain operation, right? It's another one of these execution layer initiated things, so it would just be another transaction type. So then that wouldn't be gossiped at all. In which case, that kind of lends itself to saying maybe we shouldn't add a gossip topic for these things, because we'll probably in the future have the execution layer handle these kinds of operations. Or the execution layer initiated.
Yeah, it feels
I
intuitively
would
like it all
actually-
should come from the EM, right?
What's that?
Yeah, I agree with Mike that, this should now be an EL triggered, because right now, security-wise, all assumptions are that validator is actually owned by the withdrawal address. and is operated by the validator keys. So there is
Yeah.
this trust assumption that has been absorbed into the ecosystem, and I think we would not want to break it.
Yes.
Because I will
We're
don't know
not-
how people have
We're
configured it.
not proposing breaking it. I was misunderstanding in my initial question. As he said, it would be initiated via the withdrawal address on the execution layer. That's the only way it could maintain security. That would.
So if it's then if one has to do it that way, then just bundle it in the execution payload and process
Yeah.
it. Why do we need extra gossiping for that?
We don't. So, like, the way this discussion evolved is, first is changing to a BLS or changing to a compounding withdrawal credential. That has no security implementation or implications. So, like, that could be done with a gossip topic, but then Mike was saying, well, it would make sense to bundle it with the execution layer change, that is execution layer initiated. And then we were thinking, yeah, it actually makes more sense to just have both of these operations be execution layer initiated. So in a way, it's like this changes a little bit the interpretation of 7002. The really important part about 7002 is that it introduces SSZ into the execution layer and begins an era of execution layer initiated operations that affect the consensus layer. And in the future, we should continue probably moving with that paradigm. Yes, SSZ is going to be in the execution layer with 7002, correct?
Not with 7002.
Oh, I thought that was.
No,
Wait.
it's
Am I getting my EIP numbers mixed up? The execution
Are
layer.
you saying maxEB or 7002 is execution layer triggered withdrawal?
Yes, that my understanding is that SSZ aren't those operations?
The operations are passed over the engine API, so they're just a JSON object. They go into the 7002 pre-deploy contract. In the pre-deploy contract, the 48 plus 20 bytes, the 68 bytes are split across three 32-byte storage elements. So they're just kind of concatenated.
Okay, my whole understanding was.
So basically, the queuing mechanism for the exits on the execution layer side, basically the execution layer is going to give the beacon chain 16 withdrawals every block, that it has 16 available withdrawals. And to get those withdrawals, it reads it from a queue that's maintained by a smart contract. And so as a part of a system operation, kind of like the 4788 beacon routes contract, it calls that smart contract at the end of the block and says, pop off either 16 or as many exits as you have, withdrawals as you have. And then it just sends that over engine API to the consensus client. And so there isn't really a modification to the header in that case, because the queue is just written to the state.
Okay, I think I got that idea from the EIP where it says consensus layer, sketch of spec, new operation execution layer will show up in the execution payload as an SSZ list bounded by length max exits per block.
Right, but the consensus layer, the client is going to construct the SSZ list because it's going to receive the new payload over JSON. So it's going to interpret the JSON list of withdrawal operations and plug them into the execution payload object as it constructs it.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then as it gives that stuff to the execution layer, then it will put it in the JSON engine API, and the execution layer will interpret it.
Okay, so it's just embedded in the block and sent as bytes like JSON. Okay. Is this? Do you think we would follow this paradigm with? Do you think we would follow this paradigm with future execution layer initiated operations?
I would need to think about it a little bit. I think it matters a lot if you're going to add something to the header, because the main place that SSZ has been debated is as like, what is the accumulator in the header? You know, we have a list of transactions, we have a list of receipts, we have a list of withdrawals. There's always the question, should that list be a Merkle-Patricia tree or should that list be an SSZ, SSZ hash tree root? And so if something is going into the header, which in 7002 it's not, it's less of a debate because the data is just sort of encoded in the Merkle-Patricia state trie.
I see.
So if we have operations which need to go into the header for whatever reason, probably those operations would be some things that are triggered by the beacon chain. That's my guess, because that's how withdrawals work. Like if it's triggered by the beacon chain, then you have to propagate it from the beacon client to the execution client over engine API in the execution payload header or execution payload, and then it's part of the header. But if it's at the end of the block, like many of the EL triggered things are, I don't think it is going to have to be in the execution header because it's validated at the end of the block and it's just shipped over to the CL.
Okay, so I see. So your contention was that
So in that case, Matt, then basically ELs can just also provide it in the SSE format so that CL does not have to do any, take the field, transform it and put the field back for
Well, I
beacon
mean,
block.
we're gonna put it over the engine API, and the engine API is in JSON, so it's probably not going to be SSE.
So well, the whole question here is whether it gets Merkleized, if I'm right or wrong here, because
Which one?
well, so when something gets put in the header, you're putting the root in the header, and then that means you're Merkleizing it, and then the question comes, Merkleizing it with SSE or with our RLP, right? Am I understand? I don't know if I'm understanding right, but I think
I'm talking only about the execution layer's header, like not the execution payload header. The execution payload header, everything that is in there is basically SSE, but we kind of get that for free because the consensus client is just going to be doing those things. The execution layer header is only shows up on the consensus side through the block hash. So when you do like your optimistic verification of the block hash, that's like what the header is to us on the execution side. And as long as that data isn't being modified, then I don't think that we have to worry too much about encoding because everything will just be put into JSON and then interpreted by the respective side of the client server relationship.
okay.
Does that make sense, or am I just?
I'm trying to digest what I think you just spoke a little fast, but so you said that at the end of the day it comes down to whether or not things are included in the not the execution payload header, but the execution layer block header, because the execution layer block header, I don't know if I'm using the right terms, is
You have it.
to calculate the hash of the block, and the consensus layer still has to verify the hash of the block in optimistic sync. Is that the only place where this comes in, like in terms of this whole discussion? So like if the consensus layer didn't have to verify the block hash in this optimistic sync case, then you could do fuck all to the header and it wouldn't matter?
I think so.
Stick with RLP or whatever, or you could do whatever you choose. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so, mainly. I think it got a little bit complicated with the transaction byte data because we didn't want to define all the transactions in SSE also. Like there was a lot of spec work that would have needed to be done to propagate the transactions by the JSON object and then the CL interprets it. But for most of the stuff that we're talking about now, withdrawals or exits, these are really simple operations with usually like 2 or 3 elements. So it's very simple to define the SSE spec for it. So we don't care as much.
Okay, yeah, I think this is something that maybe a few people on this call are also agreeing on, that we need discussion with EL devs understand. So, okay. And what motivates something to be in the execution layer block header? So I'm clear. Why would we want something to be in the execution layer block header?
I think the main reason is if you're wanting on the execution side to be able to verify a block in isolation. So the withdrawals is a good example of that. You can't verify the withdrawal. Like it's nice, like just the way that our client architecture is for a consensus client to say, this is the head of the chain, go ahead and reverse sync back. And then it's, at some point, like start doing some verification of blocks.
Okay, so
we can actually,
another reason.
So we'll actually get the withdrawals, like we have our execution block header, and then we have an execution block body. And the block body has the transactions, the receipts, and the withdrawals. So we can actually Merkleize the withdrawals and make sure that that whole header chain is correct.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll this meeting will run as long as whenever, and people can drop off whenever, but this is interesting whenever people have to go, but this is a good discussion so far. Okay, so the implications, what I'm gathering at least, is that the implications of whether or not something goes into the block header, yeah, they have implications for sync on the EL side, but they also are going to have major, I would think, implications for light clients. Because with light clients, ideally, you're able to say, like, this is the head of the chain. I can say that this is the head of the chain, and I can sync that easily, and then I can Merkle proof anything I want about the state. Right? That's the whole idea of a light client. And so
yeah, the question becomes a little bit more complicated now that the light clients are really following the consensus layer, and most of the data is available through the consensus layer, like withdrawals. Like you have a withdrawals object or like list also in the consensus layer. So the light client could go through that if it needed to. But there's also the case where there's data that I think it might come in more for like between layer 1 and layer 2. Like there has been a debate about SSZ-ifying the receipts because verifying the data within a receipt is expensive because we don't chunk the actual like raw data at all. So if an L2 wants to verify something in a receipt, it has to put the whole receipt on their chain to verify it, rather than like a Merkle proof to like a 32-byte chunk. So in that case, there's no receipts on the consensus layer, so the only source of truth is by going through the block hash of the execution layer block.
Okay. Which we now have, okay. So we got on this discussion originally with about, I made a decision coming down on, do we want to do execution layer initiated, let's consider the operation of execution layer initiated
consolidation.
Consolidate. I don't think that's possible because they don't have, it would, but execution, it would be prefix, execution layer initiated prefix changes, right? That's go ahead, Matt.
Oh, sorry, I was just asking if the consolidation is the key that does it, the validator key, or is it the colder key?
So the way the spec is written right now, first of all, in order to consolidate, you have to be the same withdrawal credentials. So like there's not security implications of consolidating since both validators are pointing to the same place. And then you can initiate it with the validator key.
Okay, yeah. So the way that 7002 works is it basically optimistically accepts the withdrawal, and then it just pipes them directly to the consensus layer, and then the consensus layer looks up the validator pub key, and if the sender of the withdrawal request is the withdrawal credential, the 20-byte withdrawal credential, then it would accept that withdrawal. And so I think for consolidation or prefix change, if you're okay with allowing the authority to be with the withdrawal credential on the execution layer, then you can have the same thing happen, where the withdrawal credential on the execution layer says, I would like to consolidate list of pub keys, list of validator indexes, whichever. Then that would propagate to the consensus layer optimistically. The consensus layer would go through that list, and whichever ones are valid, like not all of them have to be valid, but whichever ones are valid, it would process that as a consolidation because the execution layer verified the authorization, the authentication of the operation.
Yeah, the only and I think that's a feasible thing. It's just that there's a fair amount of rate limiting that happens on the consensus layer because we can't have, like, for security reasons, like we have to delay and let these operations kind of bleed in slowly. So we have queues, but
Is the rate limiting like a fixed rate usually, or how does that work? Like, is it just as simple as there's a max number per slot that you would allow, or is that much more dynamic than that?
I'd have to go check the spec real quick, but this brings me.
It goes through the same churn limit as normal deposits, right? So it just depends on the total amount of stake.
Yeah, I think there's just a queue where you add, okay. So you add pending withdrawals to a queue, pending withdrawal or pending partial withdrawals to a queue. It's just a FIFO queue, and then, every epoch you have like an allowance of how much you can withdraw, and it just gets pushed through. But and right now the spec is saved, so there's a max withdrawal operations per block, and right now half of them go to that queue and half go to the existing queue that just iterates through the validator set.
The reason here is that you still need all of the consolidating stake to have accountable safety, right? So you still need to be able to slash it if either of the consolidating validating indices commit a slashing violation during the weak subjectivity period. So the whole point is like you're almost doing an exit when you're doing a consolidation, but you don't actually go through the process of removing the stake. You just wait through the withdrawal period, and then you move all of the stake from one indice to another. That's the point. But yeah, I agree with you, Matt, that like the triggering could come from the execution side. And I don't think that changes the trust assumptions at all either with 7002. Like, because if the 20 byte EL address wanted to consolidate, but didn't have the means to do so through the protocol, they could just withdraw fully and then deploy a new validator. So it's like they own the stake either way. So yeah, I think that's fine. But yeah, I guess this feels a bit like bike shed. I'm not sure it's.
Oh yeah,
that.
But I think the discussion kind of sprawled because we were talking about. I mean, we were interested in understanding the implications of making things execution layer initiated versus and like how difficult that is. Okay, so I guess, I mean, I think we've covered a lot. I guess, like, what are people feeling now? Like, what are the open questions? How do people feel after this meeting in terms of like things that were discussed? Like, do we feel? Is there just more questions than there were answers? Like, I know sometimes people felt like that after the other the inclusion list meeting breakout, but
I feel like the fact that you're pointing out the gaps in the maxEB spec, I feel like I didn't realize that they were there and like pretty substantive, so that's good.
Yeah.
I feel like I kind of have to re-review the latest inclusion list designs to like like I guess weigh both of these changes, but I don't know, we're getting there.
Yeah, and then yeah, those gaps in the spec though are, I mean, like I said, I feel the major one is just sign consolidations, but honestly, one thing is having the sign consolidations be execution layer initiated would be a great way to not have a gossip topic, to offload some of the work from the consensus layer, and to not require you to have a minimum, like, 'cause the only other way to consolidate if we don't have this gossip topic is to wait for a block proposal. And so, um, like, okay, there was a spectrum of how difficult to implement versus really nice user experience, right? Really nice user experience is you broadcast your consolidation whenever you want to do it, or you broadcast your change to compounding withdrawal credentials whenever you want to do it. Worse user experience is you have to wait for a block proposal in order to consolidate, or you have to make a deposit to the deposit contract of at least 1 ETH in order to change to a compounding withdrawal credential. One way to get less complexity and good user experience is actually to make these both execution layer initiated. Because then you can do it whenever you want, and you can do it whenever you want, and also just you don't have to have a gossip topic and gossip beacon chain operations. Does anyone have opinions about that? Okay, that's it. I mean, it's just something to think about. But yeah, so I think maybe the takeaway from the meetings is like, I think the thing that Mike said was prescient, which is like, there's a little bit more work to do on the spec side for maxEB, but maxEB feels like a simpler engineering effort.
My impression is sort of like there are some parts of the inclusion list design that could maybe change, and that would change the engineering kind of drastically. And that'd be like whether or not the inclusion list is referenced by the block in the current spot or whatever, current slot like committed to. So like I think that's what's tough with inclusion lists, is it does feel like there is uncertainty. Whereas like the maxEB designs, like yeah, we're still deciding between, I guess, how to do consolidations, but like both solutions are very, very tangible.
Yeah.
Like the whole of maxEB just feels more tangible to me.
Yeah, like these are more or less like we were saying, it's a little bit of bike shedding. So like we have good solutions at hand with minor trade-offs. It's not like they're a blocker. We just make the decision. And then because the biggest issue here, I know this is a maxEB call, but the biggest issue here is like, we're ultimately deciding what are the order of the forks, what are our options, what does the landscape look like, and why were you thinking that inclusion list had more uncertainty? Because like I think that's really the goal of this call. The goal of this call is like, how does maxEB compare to inclusion lists in Electra?
Yeah. So I think like I have to think through this more, but I'm a little skeptical of like the fact that inclusion lists could potentially, like they're being lumped in with regular transactions in the next block, if I understood the current design correctly, but they have a property that's like distinct from regular transactions, and that's like next block inclusion, and like we're not fully sure of like what is the impact of that. So I don't know. I think that's something to think about more. I think what we were describing, where inclusion lists are similar to blobs in that like they're prod guessed as a block extension, but different in terms of like they don't actually impact fork choice.
Right.
Is like that is a relatively simple way to deal with them, but it is, I think Gajinder mentioned this, like inherently different from anything else we have, like we've built already. So it's like we're handling a new class of data differently, I guess. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and to clarify, they do impact fork choice in the sense that you must have both before you can attest. But that's,
Yeah.
or that's, I guess that's not fork choice, but that's like whether you, well, it kind of is, because it's like whether you can really make it the head. Is that not correct? But then,
Yeah.
but if everyone else saw it and made it the head, and then attestations go for it, you can still make it the head, even if you didn't see it on time. You just won't attest
Right.
on time.
So it's like there's just I guess a new dimension of reasoning about inclusion lists that like doesn't seem to exist with maxEB.
Right. Yeah, and it doesn't seem too hard to implement, but yeah, it is. It is, yeah, because that weird, yeah, it's a weird middle ground between blobs and regular blocks, I guess, and that does introduce some potentially future complexity even too, because you always got to consider this corner case object.
Yeah.
Out there object, yeah. Okay.
I think what I'll take away from this is really, especially with the notes that I'm gonna make, is really just make like a sort of overview of just some of the design choices, I guess, that we've come up with here, and actually just push it out there for other teams just read and being like, hey, do a comparison between where we're at with maxEB and where other things are at right now, and just take it with you, give it some thought, and then if we come together on like an ACDC call and just decide then with the other teams how to proceed with what we build first or what we include in all these things, like maybe we can just give people an update on where maxEB is at. That's at least what I took away from this.
Yeah. Okay. That's not a bad idea. Yeah, and then I think I'll also, yeah, I think go read more about inclusion lists as well to understand, but I think we're pulling closer. I mean, and maybe this whole process is just getting enough people to a critical mass of understanding of both that we can make a realistic decision. So, okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
But I do think it's a very productive discussion. There's another one on Friday, and you don't have to attend or anything. If you want to attend, it'll be more talk about these considerations with more people, or like different people. So
yeah, I won't be there, but feel free to take the doc and just go over some of the things we've decided, some things that we haven't decided, and see if we can push the argument a little bit further, I guess.
Sounds good. Well, thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks for hosting, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. See you later, guys.
Bye, guys.
See you guys.